series. I'm Jenny Nelson. I'm a lecturer in modern languages and also co-theme lead of the history and heritage research theme. I'd like to thank the team at UCC and also Cardiff colleagues for their work so far in getting the series off the ground. We are looking for participants, so please do get in touch with myself or with Dr. Martha Aliba if you'd like to contribute or take part in the series. In terms of today's session, we will be recording the session, it's now recording, to allow for greater dissemination and engagement. So I hope everybody is on board with that. And we will begin with a brief introduction from Professor Ambrina Manji, who is Dean for Africa at Cardiff University. So whenever you're ready. Oh, and one more thing, please do submit your questions via the Q&A function, and we'll be happy to unmute participants, or if the technical issues agree with us, for you to ask questions directly during the Q&A.
Thanks, Jenny, and good evening, colleagues. It's fantastic to see you, all of you here, and it's great to see this seminar series come together. Many thanks to colleagues who've worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen. I hope that this will be the first of many joint seminars between the University of the Cape Coast and ourselves here at Cardiff University. I'm the university's Africa Dean. And so I just wanted to say a little bit to contextualize the seminar series and what we've been thinking of in trying to create this series. We have, many of you will know, a long-standing collaboration between Cardiff University and UCC, which has its origins in really excellent long-standing work between our schools of optometry. And on a visit to Cardiff last year by colleagues from UCC, we agreed that we would try to spread the benefits, if you like, of that collaboration more widely across our two institutions. We take what you've all achieved in optometry as our model, and we would like our colleagues here at Cardiff and at UCC to become more familiar with each other's work, to think of each other as collaborators, to put in joint research bids, to think about writing work together. And all of those things are possible if we get to know each other well. And this seminar series is one way of doing that. If we can meet regularly, learn about each other's scholarship, discuss our ideas, that I think out of that will naturally come deeper and long-standing collaborations. And it's as a result of that sort of work that then, as institutions, we can think about taking our relationship further and perhaps think about formalizing that relationship. So, for example, in the way of a collaborative agreement or a partnership. But it's very important to me that our partnerships are reflection of work across our institutions. They may come from one school, they may have their origins in relationships built by one school, but they must be spread, I think, across our institutions so that they are long-lasting and they're robust and they're deep. And so with all of that in mind, I'm really pleased to see this seminar series begin. If you have ideas for papers that you would like to present, be that finished work or work in progress, then please do get in touch, and it would be lovely to be able to continue this series over the next few months. And I'm looking forward very much to sitting quietly in the background and listening to the presentations, and then to taking part in the discussion as well. And I'll hand over now to Dr. Nisbet. Thank you so much for offering to chair. It's wonderful to have you with us, and I'm looking forward very much to the two speakers.
Okay, thank you. I think there was a little bit difficulty, but I think you all can hear me. Yes, okay, great. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for also being a part of this collaboration that we are starting. So I welcome everyone also to the first launch of the UCC Cardiff seminar series. So we have two main speakers today that will be speaking on two different topics. First, we have Dr. Nunu, who will present for about 30 minutes. And he will present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes of question and answer. But before I introduce him, I introduce myself. My name is Dr. Mario Nisbet. I'm a lecturer here at UCC in the Center of African and International Studies. And I work on issues dealing with Pan-Africanism, African diaspora, and issues of sovereignty. So now, in terms of the two speakers, the first speaker we have is Dr. Nunu, Dr. Isaac Nunu. Dr. Nunu is a lecturer at the Center of African and International Studies, University of Cape Coast, Ghana, and he's also adjunct faculty member at Keene University, China campus. His research interest covers foreign policy analysis, diplomacy, security, agency in Sino-Africa relations, political vigilantism, and electoral violence. He has published scholarly articles in journals such as the Journal of China, the China Journal, the African Review, Africa Review, Global Affairs, Terrorism, Political Violence, SN Social Sciences, and many more other journals. So please help me welcome Dr. Nunu with his presentation. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? I was struggling to unmute.
Yes, good now.
Good, I'm glad. I was actually struggling to unmute. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, colleagues. And thank you, those who have put this together. So, let me say that my work is still quite in progress, even though we started way back 2023, because of the nature of the data that we want and the fact checking that we have to do. But wherever we are, we've been able to put together something that is of some substance to share with colleagues and those who are here. So that's what I'm looking at. Balance of power, alliance formation, and diplomacy in pre-colonial and colonial Africa, with a focus on trying to add to the debate on non-Western international relations, which requires that IR as a discipline as it is, and how it's so much Eurocentric and American-centric oriented, the need to move outside that and look at other alternative narratives that help to augment the discipline. Because as it stands, we feel that the discipline is quite narrowed, not in terms of scope, but in terms of the global north, focusing so much on the West. And sometimes we tend to ask, what about the South? What about the East? What about the things that happen in Africa? So it is to add to that debate that this work is actually ongoing. This is my outline. We try to at least in some form of introduction, the focus of it, some theory that helps to explain and my materials. And the analysis is focused on what you see here, the 5 main things that you see here, in addition to some major cases that we try to look at in order to help us explain some of the concepts that we have in the title and also in the abstract. Not everything here will be discussed because of time, but we'll do our best to at least capture most of them here. We'll try to also look at the challenges that have made it quite difficult for us to decouple the discipline, given even the history. If you look at the history of international relations, virtually everything is focused on the West and their activities. What about those that during colonial period they came to meet, and what about the engagement even before colonial period? We conclude based on that, and then we'll try to make some recommendations. In fact, when I say we, probably I'm referring to I, me, and myself, and those who might have helped me with the data collection. I start by putting this controversial statement there. The first one is believed to be the actual statement without any additions or insertions made by the Regius Professor of Modern History, Oxford University, okay, Roper, Trevor Roper. Perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness. Others who have analyzed the statement over the, in fact, it's actually received a barrage of criticisms. They have actually added that he actually went beyond that to add all that you see that I don't want to go into that. In fact, criticizing the statement by him, John Donnell Fudge, in fact, makes it clear that this was so Eurocentric to the extent that even the Europeans' own engagement with the people that they met outside Europe is drowned largely. As if that was not enough, in 2007, giving a speech in Dakar, Nicolas Sarkozy also added his voice. And that's what he said, interestingly, not fully entered, Africa has not fully entered into history. Those people live in an imaginary world devoid of human adventure or idea of progress, wallowing in static order where everything seems to have been written beforehand, and who need to realize that the golden age that Africa is forever recalling will not return because it has never truly, that's my word, existed. Now, these pronouncements and these conceptions or misconceptions have further given strength to the debate on non-Western international relations. In fact, Morgenthau, one of the key figures in international relations, has also made a statement to the fact that African politics is not the level where it be considered in global politics. Now, putting all together, it becomes necessary to now begin to look at which other ways has Africa and Africans contributed to anything that makes sense when it comes to terms and concepts like balance of power, diplomacy, and alliance formation in international relations. And let me say that the idea is not necessarily to criticize the discipline, but to see what and what can be added to augment, to a kind of dispel these kind of, if I should put it, mischief perceptions that some individuals try to put out there. And that's the essence of why this work has become necessary. If you look at the definition of international relations, obviously some makes it clear that it goes beyond state-based relations. Others, like Lawson, limit it essentially to state-based actors, which means that others that are not classified as states, whatever they do, and it's one of the reasons why it has become so Eurocentric and it's not considered so much in the narratives. But obviously, it goes beyond that. The debate on non-Western international relations, interestingly, is not only engaging by African scholars or global South scholars. In fact, we have Barry Buzan, my own professor, George Lawson, and Amitav Achaya of Harvard University, all adding their voice to it. Unfortunately, their work also kind of concentrated so much on Asia, largely limiting or drowning Africa in the process. If you look at the evolution of the international system today, and even the study of IR, usually the 5 stages of the international system that we focus at. Essentially, you see that all the stages refer to activities that were largely engaged in by Europeans at the expense of the other parties that were also party to a number of them. The very first big mandate in international relations we are so focused on in terms of sovereignty, the territorial integrity and stuff like that. Westphalia, those who made the purely Europeans deciding on their own fate after the 30-year war. Through that to the Austrian, the same thing, usually still about the Europeans, through the Vienna Conference, still about the Europeans, to the second big bang, 1919, end of World War, still about the European, even to the end of World War II, the agreement that was signed and the 3 big weights that made Churchill, Roosevelt, and of course, Joseph Stalin. What about the Africans and the role they played? Largely. So we're looking at, and this actually, the history of international relations principally hinges on these 5 stages of the international system. So when you look at it, it's obvious that though we have instances where Africa, by their engagement, can be used and be referred to in discussing a number of the concepts in international relations, because the focus has mostly been on what the Europeans were engaged in. We tend to forget about that, and that has necessitated the need for works that look at the other alternatives. People like Emmanuel Wallenstein, for instance, has actually described Hoffman. In fact, Hoffman, the American side, has actually described the discipline as an American social science. And the social science in this broad sense, according to Emmanuel Wallenstein, has been that Eurocentric on the basis of these 5 elements that you see: the historiography, universal, civilization, Orientalism, belief in progress. And I must say that this is not a case that is more like, if it's a crime, then it's only being committed by Europeans, but even Africans themselves, to a large extent, sometimes also add to this. And I must say that if, for instance, you are here listening to me and the focus is to pay attention to how well I'm able to articulate a language that was imposed on me on the, based on certain circumstances, I must say I will disappoint you, because I'm only managing it. I'm not an English professor. So these are some of the things. You have Africans who are so preoccupied with these things. So whatever they do, the focus is on that. So we look at diplomacy, we look at alliance formation, we look at balance of power. Diplomacy, what I simply put it as an engagement between state and sometimes non-state actors through negotiations, conversations, and other means other than war. And essentially, these are done for the purposes of forming an alliance. It could be for security reasons, it could be for economic reasons or other reasons. And in most cases, when it's about economic and security reasons, it ends up in achieving a particular purpose. And that is what we usually refer to as balance of power, where a threat will be identified, or potential threat may be identified maybe by state A, by state B, by state C. And you want to balance that threat. You want to empower yourself in order that you are not overtaken by event. And so, for instance, if I am a state, or we have a state A and state B begins to rise in terms of power, hard power capability, soft power capability, its economy, its military, you begin to see that no, this one can pose a problem one day. So you try to engage other powers, you try to engage other states to form an alliance, be able to check the rising threats. Some people like Randall Schwaller refers to that as balancing interest, but largely you tend to balance a threat, a potential threat that you see and you think that you have to do something about. So usually when they engage in a diplomatic discourse, it is meant for a purpose. It could be an alliance formation towards balancing a particular rising power, like we had the case of the Athens and the Melos trying to balance the Spartans. We have a case in Ghana where the Asantes form alliance with the Dutch and with the Lemanians to balance the Fantis and the British. We have several other cases in the Swahili coastal areas too, where Nzinga, Queen Nzinga and her Indongo and Matamba kingdoms try to balance Portuguese threat by forming an alliance with the Dutch and other neighboring states as well. Now, what we're saying that these particular concept terms, when you come to the African side, we have many instances that go to explain this, that we don't need to necessarily limit ourselves to only engagement that involves Europeans, and in most cases outside Africa or only in Europe, that we have cases that, and let me say, if it's a crime, it's committed by all of us, both global South scholars and then the North, because you have African scholars who teach international relations, and almost all references in terms of cases that they refer to are European. Even when they have instances in the global South and in particular Africa, you tend to see them, ignoring those instances because that is what they have come to meet, and they must continue to give the same narratives. So the focus of it is to explore and incorporate African perspectives on diplomacy, alliance formation, and power balancing, which the existing IR to a large extent has actually drowned, has ignored, and it is being done as part of the non-Western international relations debate. My main contention, others may refer to it as a thesis statement, but that's not my thing. I prefer the puzzle or argument, is that although traditional IR approach has been dominated by Eurocentric and American-centric narratives, at the neglect of the rich history of balance of power, alliance formation, diplomacy in pre- and colonial Africa, the pre- and colonial African did not only have societies and states and tribes that engage in diplomatic relations and formal alliances for political and economic reasons, but that they also practice those political engagement according to civilized standards. The theory that I am relying on for now, it's likely I may change, maybe one of them, is actually the critical theory and then the post-colonial theory. Now, these theories are being used because they seem to go outside the box and to make a case for the need to go beyond the Eurocentric nature of looking at things, but particularly in academia and the theories that they actually critique the existing theories in global politics and international relations. For instance, the issue of power structures, where we have the peripheral and then the nucleus, the great powers, small powers, middle powers, and stuff like that. And so when we apply it to the work, we begin to appreciate Africans and their relations with the great powers, even at the time and during colonial period and even the post-colonial period, in that it gives us that room to look at agency that these African nations might have exercised at the time and even now, ability to accept. For instance, like Pan-Africanism, where you look at the stages, as I mentioned, and the entire history of international relations, and you hardly find Pan-Africanism there, even though by 1900, it had become a formal political movement and really engaged the European powers and the African continent. Likely it's by the activities that OAU was formed, and many of the nationalist movements actually came out of that, which eventually kind of gained independence for most of the African nations. Yet you hardly find Pan-Africanism in its activities in international relations discourse, which is quite disturbing. And so such theories help us to do that. If you take the post-colonial theory, for instance, the fact that it highlights marginalized perspectives, exactly what the work seeks to address, it makes it important for what we intend to do, and the need to obviously give narrative that shows African agency in international relations largely. It doesn't mean that these theories do not have limitations. Of course, they do have. For instance, post-colonial theory has been criticized for focusing too much on the colonized and sometimes limiting the whole thing without considering the other party as well. If you take critical theory, it is believed that those who are giving out the critical theories themselves are Europeans to a large extent, and so they might have been influenced by their own European understanding. However, I believe strongly that with the issue of false consciousness, with the issue of the power diversity in terms of power and the power structure, the systemic factors and the African side and what they might have added or challenged those systemic factors, it's still an important theory that can be considered in trying to explain. But going forward, if it becomes necessary that one or both have to be changed, I shall look at that. Materials, the work is largely qualitative in nature, relying on cases, in fact, more of process tracing, historical analysis. Some of the cases that I considered, and I'm still considering, are those that I have bulleted here. My interviews for now, 15, but it's likely to go beyond that. And afterthought, I'm also considering actually visiting some of the palaces to see if they also have some document that the archives have not been able to give me. And some of the archives, I must say, as a limitation, you have to translate them because they are in Portuguese, they are in French, they are in Swahili. So I have to translate them, sometimes using Google Translator. And because of that, I'm still trying to do a lot of fact checking to be sure that the information the archives are given are also accurate before I even incorporate them into the work proper. Sampling, obviously, given the nature of work I'm doing, is purposive, and the analysis is based on the theme that emerged from the data as I have. So coming to the analysis itself, we first try to, I've explained, me and myself, we first try to look at the political structures, the nature, overview of the political system, the dynamics of the politics in pre-colonial and also the colonial period. And I must say, when I say pre-colonial, it does not mean before the arrival of Europeans, though. You know, somewhere here over 100 years before even colonialism actually kicked in. So it does not mean by the time pre-colonial, more like up to the time that colonization took shape proper. That's the essence of it. We realize that Africans had diverse political structures. One, we had centralized kingdoms and decentralized societies. And this is some of the problem because we focus so much in international relations on nation states. And usually the reference point is Italian city-states. Yet we had the Swahili city-states as well. And then by engagement, we had the decentralized societies that were engaging other societies on equal footing, just like the engagement between the Italian city-states or the Swahilian city-states. As the centralized ones, we may have like the Mali Empire, the Asante Empire, the Asante Kingdom, the Zulu Kingdom that had that formal structures that they were following. Then the centralized ones like the Igbo Confederacy, the Somali clans, the Fanti, the Ewe communities, that on their own were also engaging even both the kingdoms and the other decentralized societies. And so this, for you to appreciate their contribution, means you have to go outside the European understanding of interstate relations to realize that it doesn't have to be necessarily in the nature of the Italian city-state for it to have a meaningful political or diplomatic relations with another society. It was the nature of that society, and it will surprise you to know the kind of politics and politicking that took place or played out among these communities. Again, we also realize that, in fact, gifts and marriage were two important elements in their diplomatic engagement. Okay, in some cases, they were actually used for the purpose of trade networks. Others were for the purpose of military alliance. It was quite interesting, and I have cases that tend to, kind of exemplify in detail some of the things. So gift became an important aspect of their diplomatic engagement. Marriage was also used part of their diplomatic engagement. If you take, for instance, the Hausa kingdoms, they formed alliances, but against threats like the Kanem Borno Empire, okay, the Asante Dagoma, for instance, and they were using marriages as part of their engagement to ensure that the alliance was secured and then the alliance would last. When the Asantes had actually, in a tributary way, maybe subdued the Dagombers, eventually what they did was to use both gifts and marriage to cement that relationship. and to engage them diplomatically, just to win their loyal to the Asante king, which really worked for them. Okay. In terms of balance of power, we also realize that in as much as they cooperated, they also had inter-kingdom rivals. For example, the Oyo Empire from the Yoruba side was an established or the dominant power in the region. The Dahomey was a rising one, the rising power. Now, the Oyo Empire intended to keep its status of position, so it did everything possible to check the rise of Dahomey. Dahomey, to be able to also rise and overcome the dominant power, more like a regional hegemon, formed alliances with other regional states or kingdoms, as well as even some foreigners, Europeans as well, to check the Oyo, and eventually they actually overpowered the Oyo and they became the dominant power in the region. The Asante and Akwemu, for instance, at some point were rivals, at some point were actually cooperative as well. When the Asantes had conquered the Dainshira, which Akwemu was an ally, then later the Akwemu, instead of being rivals, the Asantes through diplomatic strategies ensured that they rather became allies at some point and even supported them at some point against the Fantis and then the British at some point. In Ndongo, in Queen Nzenge's kingdom, the two kingdoms that she managed to put together, Ndongo and Matamba, and then the Dutch alliance, for instance, the Ndongo and Matamba were not always cooperative, but they managed at some point by the ingenuity of Queen Nzenga to ensure that Matamba understood that they had a common enemy, the Portuguese, and that there was a need for them to join forces to be able to counterbalance the Portuguese. And in addition, from the 40s, she equally joined the Dutch as well. And so we realized all these were playing out in their political engagement. Now, beyond the marriages and gifts in general, specifically gift giving as a diplomatic strategy were engaging by kingdoms like the Congo, kingdoms like the Asante, I mentioned earlier, kingdoms like the Swahili. But specifically, if you take, for instance, the Congo case, we had a situation where King Afonso himself actually was sending ivory, copper, slaves, and other things to Portugal in exchange for firearms. They were gifts in exchange for firearms, textiles, and wine and missionary. In fact, he himself converted to Christianity with the idea that I'm also a Christian just like the Orthodox. There's no need for you to conquer my kingdom or anything, because to a large extent, we are brothers. The Asantes relied on the same thing with the alliance with the Lemenes and the Dutch and the Dagomba. They relied on the same thing. The Swahilis also used the same means, the gift giving. Like, for instance, Kilwa and Mombasa exchanged those precious goods like gold, ivory, and spices with Arab traders in order to maintain trade networks and also secure profitable relationships. When I go to the main cases, details are actually given there. Back to, if you take the Swahili coast again, typically there was a case where they engaged in what they refer to as the giraffe gift. The giraffe gift was a highly diplomatic engagement, that for you to be given a giraffe mean that you are well respected, and also they value that kind of diplomatic engagement. So when the emperor from the Ming Dynasty, China, Emperor Yongle, visited the Sultan of Malindi, which is actually part of present-day Kenya, Swahili city-state, part of present-day Kenya. It was the giraffe that they gave him, which he sent back. And from that time, trade network actually opened between the two authorities, which actually made the people, they believe, quite rich to that extent. Not only that, those cities, some of them also were giving gifts to the Sultan of Oman. In fact, Sultan of Oman had in the 1700s, right? In the 17th century, 1600s, in the 17th century, actually taking Zanzibar from the Portuguese. And the ruler of Zanzibar, what he did was to send gifts to the Sultan of Oman to win his favor and to thank him and to say that, and it was a highly diplomatic motive. It was based on a highly diplomatic motive to just tell him that, okay, now you have liberated this place from the Portuguese. What we want to tell you that we want to have some autonomy. So you are going to rule here, but we want to have some form of autonomy. So it was done for him so that later the ruler of Oman will still consider him as a ruler there and maintain him with some form of autonomy. It was quite interesting, right? In fact, it was so successful. What they did was so successful that in the 1840s, so the place actually became the capital of the Oman, East Africa, which was quite interesting. They did the same thing to even the Portuguese governors and officials. For instance, rulers of Mombasa and Sofala were given the items, as you see, the gold coins, etc., to Portuguese governors and officials. We have a case where King Musa of Mombasa himself sent gifts to Francisco de Amela, the Portuguese governor in India, just to forge good relationship. And sometimes they did this to just win their favor, so that even if, and sometimes just to tell them, when you conquer those around us, here, remember that we are your ally or partner to a large extent, or that when you even conquer here, do not supplant our reign, do not supplant us with any other authorities. You can allow us to continue with our ruling. And that was really working for them. Kingdoms like the Zulu kingdom, Shaka did the same thing. Shaka Zulu did the same thing after he had conquered Peb, Metua, Ndambi, and Lubi clans. What he did was to, instead of punishing them, he rather used gifts to lure them to be loyal to his kingdom, which really helped him a lot. The Mali Empire did the same. We know of the story of Mansa Musa. In fact, it is known that when he was visiting Mecca, almost all the states along the route, he dashed them or distributed vast amounts of gold and other items to them. It was said that in Cairo, the kind of gold, the amount of gold or ounce of gold that he gave there actually led to a devaluation of the economy, which affected the economy for a decade or so. Quite interesting. But not only that, he did the same thing with the Berber tribes and even the Arabs. In fact, it's on record that they actually invited Arab scholars to Timbuktu, which actually contributed to making the place a learning center. Quite interesting. We have the Benin Kingdom now part of Nigeria, and the popular bronze artifact. The bronze artifact in particular was used to signify high diplomatic trust, diplomatic engagement, that it was not given to any ordinary person. And so to them, they were using this to forge lasting relationship with the powers at the time. And in most cases, those were the Swahili side and the southeastern side, and the Oyo, and then the Benin side, the Portuguese in particular. Because the Portuguese were in a spray, were on conquering spray. And so most of them intended to kind of limit the tension that existed. And they were relying on gifts to tell them that, no, we are your allies or we are your partners. So there's no need for you to necessarily conquer. It's on record that when Afonso, for instance, visited Oba Ozola, he actually gave him a bronze plate, which he took home. And based on that, many of the other Europeans got to know about the wealth of the place, Benin, and also decided to move in there. They believe that that facilitated trade as well. Gifts replaced most of the engagement that they had. The Lozo Kingdom had the same issue. They did the same thing. They also relied on that, even gifts to the British colonial administrators. We have King Launika, for instance, presenting ivory and cattle to British officials to secure favorable treaties with them, because I've already told you that usually it is done to say we are allies, we are partners, no need to necessarily conquer us, or even when you conquer, maintain this particular monarch. and do not change it. We had the popular Lochner concession, which had granted them the British the mining rights in exchange for British protection, because the Portuguese, because the Dutch were around, and sometimes it depends on which European power they felt comfortable with and where the interest is. They will know where to go to form an alliance in order to more or less check the other power from outside or from within that is also preparing to overtake. The Barotti Treaty, for instance, with the British South African Company, which actually formalized that British protection over the Lozi Kingdom, recognized that chief at the time, Launica, as the paramount chief. Perhaps, but for the gifts and the gestures, he would have been changed once they controlled the place, or others would have, other kingdoms, neighboring kingdoms that were also rising and looking forward to conquer others, would have challenged them and perhaps conquered them. But with that alliance, what they did, in as much as you are a protectorate, you are still the paramount chief, and you are to be accorded that respect. The Ethiopian Empire also did the same. Menelik is on record to also have given gifts, right, to forge alliances with both regional leaders and European powers. In fact, even Italy, that unfortunately after the Wuchale Treaty that failed, had to attack them. Initially, they had this good relationship where Menelik II was actually sending the Italian leader gifts, as well as France, which provided them weapons and other military support. Remember, even during the fight with Italy, when they came back, Zanzibar had the same story. And so we are saying that gifts was becoming or became an important diplomatic gesture in most of the African centralized and decentralized kingdoms, which cannot be ignored. Marriages were equally used extensively. Please, am I heard?
Hello?
Am I here?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can hear you. But in the interest of time, could you please try to wrap up the presentation? We seem to be running out of time.
Okay, that's good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Sure.
So marriages also came up from the data as one of the themes that we actually realized. For instance, the Kingdom of Congo, present day a part of Angola, that part, but then it's covered Republic DRC as well as Republic of Congo, and then part of Angola is something. Marriages were used, and we have cases where Afonso I actually married his children to Portuguese nobles to strengthen ties with the Portuguese. Buganda Kingdom also did the same thing. We have a case where the royals and the prominent traders were intermarrying, and not only the foreigners, but also even among the tribes from similar or from the same ethnic group among the tribes. Like the Bunyoro Kingdom, for instance, they use marriages to secure peace and trade networks. Kabaga Mutembi, for instance, married a prince from Bunyoro to secure peace. Okay. We have several instances. The Zulu Kingdom, Shaka Zulu also did similar thing to integrate those that he had conquered, believing that with marriages, the bond will be strengthened and loyalty will be won. Now, these are some of the typical cases that we would have loved to go into details. This is Queen Nzinga, and Nzinga's case was very simple. Nzinga, when she took over from the brother, realized that the Portuguese had been around even during the Brothers' reign, were doing everything possible to subdue her people, and the Portuguese were notorious for slave trading, right? To rule them and to enslave them. So she did everything possible to prevent that. Initially, she herself even converted to Christianity temporarily to tell the Portuguese that, hey, I am with you, I am part of you. Why are you trying to conquer me? But when that did not work, because that was temporal strategy, she straight back, but she managed to contain them. And later in the 1640s, when the Dutch had been able to conquer Luanda, the Portuguese port city, she quickly joined an alliance with the Dutch against the Portuguese. That was an alliance formation for the purposes of balancing the power of the Portuguese, for the purposes of checking the rise and the threat posed by the Portuguese. That was not only thing. She even formed alliance with other local states and kingdoms there in order to check, because they thought that they were facing the same threat. A threat was around the corner, and there was the need for alliance to be formed to check that threat. The Ndwandi kingdom did the same thing. They realized Shaka Zulu was rising too fast. And so there was the need for those kingdoms and chiefdoms to come together to balance the rise of Shaka. Even though, of course, eventually Shaka defeated them, but the motivation for that alliance was on the basis of the rise or an imminent threat, which has to do with the need for balancing and checking the rise of that threat. Okay, the Asante Kingdom, the Elimina Dutch, such an intriguing alliance, quite fluid though. Usually the story is told of the Asantes trying to conquer the Fantis to have direct access to the Europeans, but it goes beyond that when you look at it from the political perspective. Okay. The Asantes realized that, well, the Fantis were more in cahoots with the British, decided to create an alliance with the Elimina, which more like brother or sister of the Fantis, but planted a friend within the heart of the enemies to a large extent. The Dutch realized that, well, even the Asantes are the ones who are providing more of the slaves that they needed badly and more of the gold. So they also decided to join onto the alliance. So it was more like the Asantes, Elimina, and the Dutch as against the British and the Fantis. And the Dutch were giving them more of the weapons, more of the firearms to continue the fight and be able to provide more slaves for them to of course, ship to their plantations. So it wasn't just about the Asantes and the Fantis, but the nuances, the political nuances of involving the foreigners who were also, at the same time, the Dutch were also maintaining some level of engagement with the Fantis, because they were still engaging the Fantis to a large extent, even though they did not put boots on the ground to assist the Asantes. They gave them the weapons they needed, and sometimes the strategy and the techniques that they supported them. In fact, it's on record that was what helped them to overcome the action in particular. It's more because of time. Some of them I'll just skip. But the alliance was said that, which was taking proper shape from the 1715, but by 1724, it was more like they had a formal agreement. Some believe treaties, but for now we've not had records to prove the treaty, but there was a formal agreement that made largely the sole producers, the sole suppliers of the Asante weapons, and Asante the suppliers of slaves and then gold to the Dutch. Interestingly, I will skip the Tacoma because it's more of that rather.
Yes, we have about 30 minutes left, so it would be great if you could wrap up.
Right.
Yes.
So thank you. The Fanti one and the bond of 1844, the essence of it was that the Confederacy, the bond of 1844 preceded Confederacy, but the 1844 one, interestingly, is to say that that was what ushered in the process for colonization without necessarily looking at the circumstances. Asante was rising, there was an imminent threat. The Fantis felt that the only way to check balance the Asante power was to form that alliance with the British. When later they realized that the British had deceived them to a large extent, then the Fanti Confederacy was formed to check both the British and then the Dutch. So it was formed on the basis of checking that rising power, which sometimes we ignore, okay? Obviously, I said I wouldn't be able to look at everything, but I will touch on some of them. So we are saying that it is important that we move away from we ourselves relying so much on the narratives coming from the West to look at the other alternatives to augment, not necessarily to bastardize what others are written, but to augment the concept that I have outlined, which is very important. And we also realize that apart from the marriages, apart from the gift giving, most of the engagement were more tribal and ethnic in nature. Most of the powers were from the same ethnic group, but they were large tribes that have conquered other states and have formed kingdoms and have formed empires. And so to be able to understand the politics, we must necessarily remember the nature of the politics and the parties that were involved, and not necessarily they must be in the light of the Italian city-state. We cannot forget the culture, we cannot forget the tradition, we cannot forget the kingdom system. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc, for your presentation. We will quickly go to the next presenter, and then we'll have our open session for questions for both presenters after. So let me quickly introduce our next presenter. Our next presenter is Professor Gavin Murray Miller. He is a reader in history at Cardiff University. He is the author of 4 books on revolutionary politics and European imperialism. Most recently published work is Empire Unbound, France and the Muslim Mediterranean, Oxford University Press, 2022. And his other major work is Muslim Europe, How Religion and Empire Transform European Society, Lexington Book, 2024. In the past, he has held fellowship from the École Normale Supérieure Paris and the Leibniz Institute for European History in Germany, and the Center for Advanced Study in Sofia. Between 2021 and 2022, he was an Alexander van Humboldt Fellow at the Universidad Leiden. So please welcome, everyone, please welcome Professor Gavin. Please take the mic.
Okay, thank you. Can you see the screen, my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Great. So I'm going to go through this. And so on this theme of memory, cultural heritage, and decolonized past, I would like to just give me a second here to see if this is okay. Are we on the correct slide? Is it on Saint Domingue and Haiti? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I want to begin this talk in late 18th century Saint Domingue. Now, for those who aren't familiar with this area, Saint Domingue was one of France's most lucrative colonies in the Atlantic. It was known for its sugar production, and it was also known for its extensive plantation workforce that was made up of over 400,000 laborers imported via the African slave trade. In 1791, large sections of the colonial slave population rose up in rebellion. They would appeal to notions of natural rights and liberty. And in doing this, Saint-Dominguans sought to secure their own emancipation as free men and women, setting into motion a series of struggles that would culminate in the end of French rule on the island and the declaration of the free and independent nation of Haiti. Now, this unprecedented event, which saw former slaves liberating themselves from an oppressive colonial regime, has been held up as a milestone in world history. In treating the subject of the Haitian Revolution, historians have claimed that this event marked perhaps the truest fulfillment of the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality, principles which Europeans and Americans, by virtue of their imperial and racist outlooks, were ultimately reluctant to endorse. Now, this monumental narrative, however, I think begins to look quite different if one starts at the conclusion of the revolution. You see, in 1804, as French troops retreated from the island, the military leader Jean-Jacques Dessalines ordered the execution of over 2,000 French militia fighters and their families, noting the security risks these white colonists posed to Haiti's newly won independence. Now, taking note of this racialized and targeted violence, certain revisionist historians have accused Dessalines of perpetrating a genocide intended to cleanse the island of its white inhabitants. So, is the Haitian Revolution to be celebrated as a successful example of anti-colonial liberation? Or should it stand as a reminder of a brutal racialized vengeance? Now, these conflicting narratives, I think, raise many important questions. Questions regarding the meaning of genocide or the moral underpinnings of anti-colonial resistance in the modern world. But I want to argue that this also raises another series of questions that are relevant to history proper. And that question is, how should the Haitian Revolution be remembered? What lessons and meaning should we draw from it? And such questions are not simply historical, as I want to argue. They are actually very vital to the present world. Give a sense of this. So let's fast forward to 2018. That year, public officials in Brooklyn, New York, gathered to unveil a street sign in the neighborhood of East Flatbush for a thoroughfare recently renamed Jean-Jacques Dessalines Boulevard. Now, popularly referred to as Little Haiti, Flatbush remains home to a number of Haitian immigrants and citizens of Afro-Caribbean descent. And so the naming of this new boulevard was intended to symbolize the long presence of the Haitian community in Brooklyn. And as the city councilman Jumaane Williams indicated, as you can see in this quote. But the commemoration of Dessalines touched off a heated debate. Local newspapers pointed out that Jumaane Williams was a noted, quote-unquote, Columbus hater who had successfully participated in a campaign to have the holiday of Columbus Day renamed Indigenous Peoples Day. The controversy even piqued the attention of Fox News pundit Tucker Carlson, seen here, who lamented the fact that New York was, quote-unquote, now honoring a genocidal dictator. Well, what is it about this controversy? This controversy did not take place in isolation. It occurred in the midst of a wave of protest over statues and memorialization breaking out across the United States and world. So starting in March of 2015, student protesters at the University of Cape Town mounted the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, demanding the removal of a statue commemorating the former colonial South African minister, Cecil John Rhodes. Now, the success of student activists quickly inspired others to follow. So in Oxford, students called to have a Rhodes statue at Oriel College taken down. And these demands multiplied in the coming years to include the removal of statues of Thomas Jefferson, Edward Colston, and I think most notably, the Confederate war memorials that dotted Richmond, Virginia, which was the former capital of the Confederacy government. In one way or another, efforts by protesters drew attention to the need to decolonize public spaces and universities, insisting such monuments were an unacceptable celebration of imperial and racist values. So what does decolonization mean? Well, demands to decolonize have since extended to education curricula and even the discipline of history itself. And this push has come to include a range of activities from revising reading lists to integrating diverse non-European topics into lectures. So as one historian, as you can see here, has claimed, decolonization marks an effort to move us beyond the dominance of national and Eurocentric histories and offer a chance to diversify a past, traditionally focused on white male Europeans. These and other suggestions have sparked a public debate on the role of history, as well as the importance of public recognition and atonement in post-colonial societies. But when we look at present-day campaigners, they like to link their activities with the process of decolonization that occurred in the wake of the Second World War. But I want to stress something, that this comparison shouldn't be pushed too far. Their actions are distinct from the radical and, in some cases, violent battles that were waged in the name of post-colonial liberation. It's really the moral authority and legitimacy of these former liberation struggles carried out in the 1950s and 60s that activists today appeal to. So they are seeking a symbolic rather than a political regime change. Today, talk of decolonization emerges in various contexts, from campaigns for social justice to cultural policies promoted by Narendra Modi's nationalist government in India. And so we can see that there's a real diversity around what this concept actually means, but these diverse causes all in some way evoke what we might think of as the original promise of liberation that has made decolonization a recurring source of moral legitimacy. But it also permits a flourishing of discourses which have rendered decolonization an amorphous and slippery concept, as the historian Lydia Walker has noted. So as calls for decolonizing the curriculum and even history itself abound at Western universities, it is evident that the discipline is undergoing, I think, a self-reflective moment. So what does this tell us about our understanding of history and the past today? And that's the question I want to pose here, because I think it tells us a great deal. But to understand this, I want to look at what we call the modern discipline of history in itself. Because as this discipline evolved in the Western European world, it has relied upon a very specific understanding of time. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European scholars were instrumental in constructing what theorists have come to now deem the modern time regime. And this framework came to imagine past and present as radically distinct from one another. And now this is an idea which might seem common sense today, but I want to stress that at the time, this idea that the past and present were distinct from one another and could be looked at differently was quite innovative. But it was precisely in imagining this rupture between past and present that is what permitted scholars to begin examining the past from the standpoint of the present. So the past became the accumulation of events and experiences behind us, while the future was envisioned as open and shaped by human agency and choice. Underpinning this new historicist mentality was a specific idea of time, a temporality that was linear and it was progressive. And this essentially genealogical understanding of human life and society is what made the idea of history understood as a science intelligible and meaningful. Change over time in human affairs was what constituted history. Now, this time regime is a tool, or it was a tool, used by historians to produce knowledge. I still think it is. But it was not necessarily objective. Modernist outlooks also came to conceptualize historical change as change for the better. And this inflected this notion of time with an idea of progress and development that tended to mirror Europe's own social, political, and economic advancement. And as history became a global discipline or a global knowledge practice, it reproduced and universalized these notions of progress. So in short, we can say that Eurocentrism was written into the very fabric of historicist discourse and the modern time regime from which it developed. And I think this is important. It's important not only for thinking about what history is in its place in terms of Eurocentrism, but it's also important because in a current environment that has sought to renounce Eurocentrism, we might question what decolonizing history implies for our modern time regime. So current debates over monuments and historical memory, they suggest, I think, that conventional ideas of history and the past are being reconfigured at the moment. As figures like Dessalines and Rhodes become symbolic reference points for activists, the past has a nasty habit of bleeding into the present. We are confronted with a past that refuses to go away, as the theorist François Hartog has put it. The violence of the past suffuses post-colonial memory, and the victims and trauma of the past provide substance for current claims to restitution and recognition in the present. As these considerations come to bear on history curricula and even history writing itself, history is being recast in what I like to think is a new Gothic mode that is not only changing predominant interpretations of the past, but perhaps the very understanding of what history is. So the question is then, what do I mean by Gothic? Well, this term Gothic denotes a literary genre, and it was one popularized during the Romantic period. Gothic stories and novels commonly featured ghosts, long-buried mysteries that continued to have consequence for the here and now. So it was a genre preoccupied with history, where the violence and tragedy of the past always returns to haunt the present. And so in Gothic literature, people, places, and objects are customarily steeped in memory. Past trauma is always present and refuses to stay at rest. As John Greenway has claimed from this quote here, the Gothic is history out of time, the ghosts and violence of the past becoming visible again in the present. Well, as demands to decolonize history proliferate, and accusations of Eurocentrism serve to challenge long-standing historical narratives and practices, we are moving toward a new form of activist history writing, I think. It's one in which the past refuses to remain in the past. We inhabit a present that is haunted by old traumas and unsettled injustices that demand redress. So in the 21st century, history has acquired an eminently Gothic character. However, I would like to pause on the second part of Greenway's remark here, this quote. The Gothic offers the possibility of reevaluating the past while holding out the potential to recuperate the future. And I think it's here that strategies of decolonization are actually at work. It should not be surprising that protesters targeted public places and monuments in their various campaigns, whether street names, public memorials, or statues. These acts were oriented toward public collective memory. Monuments and memorials were deemed symbolic representations of a colonial past and its persistence within the present. So in other words, monuments were what we might think of as embodied histories of colonialism and racism that were deemed unacceptable in a post-colonial age. And here too, I think we can glimpse the idea of a haunting, a past that refuses to go away and that imposes itself on the present like a palimpsest. The effacement or removal of these symbols was in many ways a radical act. It is an affirmation that the past is to be left behind and overcome. However, recent academic works on decolonizing heritage seem posed to reject this radicalism. Various experts have come to insist that heritage should be engaged with when it comes to decolonization. Now, this has assumed various forms. They have proposed changing the language in museum exhibitions to be more inclusive. They have recommended altering the context and message surrounding colonial monuments. Others have insisted that spotlighting indigenous histories and framing history exhibitions to highlight the forgotten multiculturalism of the past are in essence quiet or quote-unquote nonviolent forms of resistance. But in all of this, what I think becomes evident is that decolonization can be a form of memory work. It aims to change collective memory or the symbolic representations of society. And in this, the embodied past, so monuments, memorials, or memory sites, have taken front seat. However, here too, we see the modern time regime being challenged, I think. Calls for imagining a more inclusive past or to highlight the forgotten multiculturalism of the past is a form of presentism. It displaces contemporary social grievances by stretching them back across the past and thereby aligning the past with the values of the present. So if protesters appeared to be reenacting or reacting to an always present past that haunts the here and now, what we see academic practitioners are doing is they are proposing reimagining the past for the sake of the present now. It is an admission that the past can always be revoked. It can always be acted upon as if the past actually was a part of the present. The past is indeed never truly past, as the novelist William Faulkner once claimed. But put otherwise, the past is not seen as separate. It is not seen as distinct from the present anymore. And in fact, I think it's quite the contrary. The past constantly merges into our present lives, mixing with the contemporary. It lies there just below the surface. And so in this context, when we think about history, history is not the analytical study of what has come before, as we might conventionally understand what history is. No, here, history becomes a tool for coming to terms with the present, for working through ongoing societal conflicts. It is, in essence, no longer historical. The past is now living. It is active. So in the 21st century, we inhabit what we might think of as a post-historical age. It's an age where the past and present commingle and blur together in odd combinations. And this preoccupation with sites of memory, I think, also begs another question. As decolonization comes to engage with heritage, as it comes to engage with public history, it will also need to engage with the so-called heritage industry. As various left critics have argued, heritage is not simply about how we remember or honor the past. Today, heritage is a form of consumption. Heritage abets tourism, for instance. It develops local economies. It attracts money from national and international funding bodies. Governments and organizations fund heritage sites in order to attract visitors, and in doing so, they essentially commodify the past. So heritage, in other words, to put it simply, I think we can say, heritage can be big business. But what happens when it becomes commodified? Well, the commodified past is often one that is deemed safe. It is deemed domesticated. Far too often, it produces very sanitized narratives of the past that are used to symbolically unify communities or appeal to tourists' desires and expectations. So this commodified past can negate or even nullify conflicts by inscribing them within a longer history. And so to give an example of this, at present, various museums and tour companies across Britain and Europe feature themes in the spirit of diversity and decolonization that spotlight multicultural histories. These will often discuss immigrant and foreign communities. They might accent the contributions made by former colonial subjects. But such exhibitions, all too often, I think, mask a certain teleology. They rely upon narratives of increasing diversity within a society. They insist that communities have always been cosmopolitan, even if we didn't realize it. Right? And I think this is a story that emphasizes transition, yes, but it always emphasizes transition towards increasing multiculturalism. So this is the narrative that is sold in many of these exhibitions. And while these narratives certainly diversify the past, they show a range of experiences, I think they effectively de-radicalize the decolonization project. They diminish the very real social and economic injustices of the present, those which activists were fighting against, and they use history, or at least a representation of the past, to do this. So the question I really would like to pose here in thinking about this is, how then can we preserve the radical implications that decolonization presents? How do we transcend the past? This is not a question I can necessarily answer here, actually. But I think it is important to speculate on this when it comes to considering the future of the decolonizing initiative and its engagement with history and heritage. And this is because the modernist project from which anti-colonial resistance movements grew from in the 20th century was committed to a revolutionary platform. It called for overthrowing regimes. It called for radically transforming institutions, and abided by a dialectical vision of history that was based in struggle and social renewal. But in the 21st century, I think this modernist project appears to be lost. The current mode of Gothic historicism I have sketched here indicates that there is a shift in the way we, at present, understand history in the past now. We now confront an always present past, a past that might be changed, it might be re-narrated in the so-called culture wars we confront today, but it is a past which cannot be radically transcended or overcome. So even as we attempt to overthrow the old, we find ourselves standing face to face with the memories and legacies the past bequeaths to us. Well, in his injunction to revolutionaries in 1852, Karl Marx chided those who consistently looked to the past for models or inspiration. And I have here a quote I've always liked from Marx. "The tradition of all past generation weighs like a nightmare upon the brain of the living," he insisted, entailing that in looking to the past, only, as he puts it, the ghosts of the old revolution would stalk the earth. For Marx, the revolution at hand could not draw its poetry from the past, as he claimed. No, it needed to look to the future. And this sentiment was also evoked in the lyrics of the International, as you can see here, in its invocation to make a clean slate of the past. Can this radical futurity, a present and future liberated from the burdens of the past, be recovered? And I think perhaps not. Today, we are obsessed with the past, if only for the sake of the present. Our cultures of memory, our preoccupations with heritage, our constant effort to reimagine the past, these are suggestive of what I'd like to think of as a post-historical consciousness. It is one in which traditional distinctions of past, present, and future no longer hold, where the past constantly returns to haunt the living rather than remain past. Thank you. And I will stop sharing.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. Thank you both for your presentation. We have a few minutes. Because of technical difficulties, we have to start a little bit late. So we have a few minutes to engage the presenters both on their excellent presentation. And they're very much connected in terms of looking at how IR could be removed from Eurocentrism, American centrism, and looking at how history can be decolonized. So we open up the questions to the audience. Are there any questions? You could raise your hand, use the hand symbol and the Zoom, and we will highlight you so you could present any question or comment or statement you have on the presentation. Are there any questions? Let's see.
I'm not seeing any hands raised.
I'm not seeing any either. But while people think about questions.
Sorry, we have got one.
Okay, yes.
We have Pascal. I'll just click now.
Okay,
Like
please,
go
Pascal,
ahead.
go ahead. Can he be unmute?
Thank you for the presentation.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
We
Yes,
can
we
hear
can
you
hear
now.
you.
Thank you for presentation. I'm from Cote d'Ivoire, and I've been listening to you quite eagerly. My concern is about the way you think Africans can rewrite their own history, since where we have information is not here in Africa. Where do you think you can collect the different information before writing this history? The first question. The second question, I saw the past is not the past. And if you consider I can say the catastrophe or the trauma of slavery, if you include this as past, not as past, don't you fear any hatred or any will to retaliate, considering the suffering of African slaves and other things? Don't you fear it? Thank you.
Okay, who was the question addressed to, Pascal?
I think that both speakers have been. The first question is to addressed to Dr. Nuno, and the second one to the first speaker. I think.
Okay, could you unmute? I think Dr. Nuno.
Yes. Could you please repeat his question for me, because I didn't really hear his question well. I was hoping that it would be written so that you could probably repeat it for me to hear it well.
Yeah, honestly, the connection wasn't so strong, Pascal,
Yeah,
because
the voice was quite
I heard you said something about history, but I wasn't hearing the word clear. I was hoping maybe my colleagues were able to hear you clearer, but the connection isn't so great. So is it possible for you to speak louder?
Or if you'd like to type in the chat, Pascal, and we could take another question while you're typing.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'll do so. I'll do so.
Okay. Do we have another question? Yes, Dr. Aliba has her hands up.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Can you please hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So thank you to the two presenters, and I enjoyed myself listening to them. I think they did great with their presentations, and I'm so thrilled by the focus of the various presentations. And so with Dr. Nunu, I'm sorry, I sometimes at a point in time I had to leave my room to connect with something else. So I didn't hear all the presentation, but I just want to mention that you gave instances relating to Mali, Benin, Ethiopia, the Lozi Kingdom and others in terms of the idea of using gifts in Africa to establish relationships or alliances. But then along our own coast, that is the Gold Coast, now Ghana, there were also instances like that. And so if you did not incorporate such instances, then I would just advise that you can add those ones as well. There were instances between the Dutch and then the Gold Coasters, as well as between the British and then the Gold Coasters, especially in the 17th century. So since your work deals with the pre-colonial period, I think these are great examples for you to include in the instances that you cite to support the argument that you make. So for me, I really want to know if it's about using what is in existence in terms of literature to project the perspective of the African with respect to diplomacy, or your research is coming up with a new finding. Because for me, the issues that you raise are already, existing in the literature. Issues relating to Mansa Musa and all of that stuff, they are in the literature. So what are we trying to do? Are we trying to bring all those together to actually make the argument that, yes, in terms of the non-Western world, the African diplomacy was also at its best? So that is for you. I don't know, you may want to respond to it, or maybe consider it and then give it a thought. But coming back to the second presenter, I think that the whole thing is about decolonization. And when we're talking about decolonizing African history, then we are looking at the historiography of Africa as a whole. And then we are looking at dimensions, including the author or who is writing, what he's writing, the sources he's using, and all those factors. For me, decolonization is not about pulling down structures, right? Because the past can never be erased. The past needs to be in existence, no matter how bad it may sound, how unpleasant, issues related to the past may sound, or how one feels about it, it cannot be erased. The past needs to be in existence. And like Trevor Roper says, we study history in order to know how we have come to be where we are. So we need to know how it all started. And then the question is, how do we build on the past? So for me, that is what is important, right? So decolonization for me is not about pulling down structures that are related to unpleasant historical experiences of people or group of people. So that is it. And when we talk about historiography in terms of deconstructing the past, then we are looking at who is writing what. What is the person using to write, right? So the perspective, that is what we want to be focusing on. But this is a great presentation. You brought on board ideas that people might not be, be paying attention to in terms of, how people respond to certain issues relating to the past out of feelings. They just take certain actions, which in a way can be described as violent in nature. Right. So on the whole, I am very much, thrilled by the presentations, and we say thank you very much to them for the great presentations that they have given us this evening. Thank you.
Yes. So maybe we start with Dr. Nunu. You want to respond, then follow up with Dr. Gavin?
Yes, actually, I mentioned the Asante Elmina Dutch, for instance, and I mentioned the Fanti. So I touched on the Gold Coast, even the Dagomba and then the Asante's marriage and other gifts that were used to cement the bond between them after they had subjugated based on the tributary system. So I mentioned that. But then let me say that the existing, of course, it's both existing extant literature, archives are important, and interviews are also. But what I believe is novel about this work is the fact that what we have sometimes is historical narrative, and sometimes it's just oral histories. But the perspective of international relations is not something that is covered. And that is what this work seeks to do. The essence of giving alternative narratives with regard to those concepts that I mentioned. I think that is the aspect that this work in particular is focused on. So I am teasing those vital information, pieces of vital information from the document, of course, archives, and from what the scholars and other important persons will give me as a source of data. That is actually the essence of the work.
Yes, thank you.
So thank you for the question. Yeah, it is an interesting one. When we think about decolonization as in terms of history writing, I would technically agree that we as historians look at this as how do we kind of deconstruct this and then look at how can we understand where we've come from, as you put it, citing Hugh Trevor Roper. Now, I agree with this in terms of we are historians looking at this. We're trained to look at things this way. One of the things that started to pique my interest, though, was that the protesters in the campaigns didn't seem to be arguing as we would as historians. And it got me wondering whether we in the academy, are we becoming out of touch with the way larger social actors and social movements are kind of presenting themselves? And that's why I kind of indicated that decolonization it seems to have all of these different meanings. I don't know when we talk about decolonizing the curriculum, for instance, are we speaking the same language as those protesters necessarily? And I don't think we are. And this was something I was trying to highlight in this kind of question of these kinds of different concepts of time that people are actually using. I have to wonder if the one we as historians use is actually the way a lot of people in society see or understand time as understand time and kind of the structure of experience there as well. So that was one of the questions I kind of brought up. But I think in terms of we as historians, we would agree with that idea that we are looking at the past to try to find out where we came from.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions? And well, while others think about a question, I guess what came to mind in both of your presentation was actually interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary research. You know, like I see that come out in both of your work in terms of what you're working on. And a question I have that is maybe basic is, can history be decolonized, and can IR be decolonized? Can both of these fields be colonized, and what is the role of interdisciplinary approach in attempts to decolonize these different fields? If we must, yes. So either one of you could go first.
Well, I think that in fact, the issue of history, I remember I've given a presentation before somewhere else outside Ghana, and I was looking at the link between history and international relations, making a case for incorporating African examples into particular history of international relations. And so first I started by making a case that Africa has history, and that what Trevor said should be ignored, what Modinta said should be ignored, what the Hermetic theory tells us should be ignored. And then on the basis of establishing that Africa has history, because we rely highly on political history to make most of our arguments. So once I establish that Africa has history, then on the basis of that, I can make arguments for Africans' place in international relations. Yes, it can be decoupled. Seriously, that's something that, but it takes you and I, particularly those of us from the global south, and those scholars from the north who have also, based on their extensive engagement with historical documents and historians from the African side, have come to realize that it is not as though those like Trevor and Co didn't know. They knew very well, but you know, some people say that history itself is relative and biased. Depending on where you are writing from and who you are, your background, you are likely to tilt in a certain way, and that is the problem. So we have a responsibility to begin to now streamline by giving our version of it based on, of course, facts, based on evidence, based on documents that we have. So it's something but it starts with some people like someone argued that you go to Nigeria and a university that runs international relations program, almost all the courses are foreign courses. You hardly have one single course that is still towards Africa itself. And I'm glad that over here at Center for African International Studies, we have a main course titled African International Relations. Now, these are all part of the attempt to decouple. And as I am teaching international relations as part of the international studies courses, I ensure that where examples are bound in Africa, I do not limit myself to only European examples. Neither should I limit myself to only African examples. I have to blend the two. In the essence of post-colonial theory, I have to blend the two to show where we come in, where the other part of the world also comes. So it's a responsibility that people like us would have to engage in, would have to ensure that we start working on it. It starts somewhere, and gradually I'll believe that it will blow out of our comfort zone and others will also begin to talk same. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I guess just to think about history and decolonization, I have to wonder whether the two are compatible. And the reason being, if we're talking about deconstructing forms of knowledge, history was very much implicit in colonialism. You had historians who basically used history to justify colonialism in the 19th century and into the 20th century. I guess in decolonizing history, if we think about that, I wonder if we can think about how we can write different types of histories, not just in terms of subject matter, but maybe even in terms of thinking about the discipline itself and how we think about concepts of time, narration. I feel we're at a point where we might be able to imagine new ways of writing about the past that I'm kind of looking forward to, actually, to see if this does develop.
Okay, thank you. I think we are a bit over time, and
I think we do have one more
question
question.
in the chat.
we do.
Mhm.
Oh yes.
Sorry, Jenny, do you want to go ahead?
So it says Dr. Martha Lieber, but I think it's somebody else who's joined through that through the
Link.
same link. So I could unmute. Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. So my question is what I've put in the chat.
Yeah.
I must say I have really enjoyed the presentations, both presentations, even though the network was not too favorable. But one thing I get is that really, I don't think we can say that international relations, the strategies then are different from now, because now we even use natural resources, which are things that have been bequeathed to us by nature for international relations. And so give me this and I'll give you that. Is it not similar to what they were doing in terms of giving out marriages and gifts? That is one. And two, for Dr. Gavin, I must say I'm not a historian, but really I have enjoyed the presentation, looking at how basic he took it from. Indeed, we cannot separate history from what we are experiencing now. And I must say that whatever that might have been experienced then, we are seeing it in a different form in our contemporary times. We are really seeing it. So what we have to do, for me, is to learn lessons from it. So I put here, what is the take home? What are we taking home? What are we taking home? Because if we are challenging the existing narratives, how different are the existing narratives from the historical ones? I think that's my comment. I don't know whether it's a question or a comment. Thank you very much. My name is Kat.
Any comments?
Well, maybe the only thing I would say that, in fact, is the more reason why these kind of alternative narratives would have to be alternative, not because we're saying that something has necessarily changed, but rather if it's virtually similar things that we are seeing, then how come that they have exotically ignored what was happening then? And it is quite true. If you look at the politics, the dynamics, the politicking, not much has changed. So how come they ignore that aspect on the African side? And I remember I had an engagement with Barry Buzan and George Lawson and Amitav Achaya from Harvard University, when Barry Buzan, George Lawson had made a case for international studies instead of international relations because of some of these non-Western international relations debates. And I was asking, what about those who are arguing for global studies, also claim that even international studies is not enough? And because I had spoken about the history, nuptial, marriage, and referring to Westphalia as a big problem for us, one of the major reasons why the whole thing has been Eurocentric. And it was trying to draw my attention to the fact that actually the Westphalian narrative even disadvantage European system as well, like, because it equally ignored the European empires, largely European empires, the Roman Empire, the Carthaginian, the Byzantine, and all those people who met there before the second rise of even Europe itself. And so what we see is that whatever was happening on the African side, what was happening at their side, and what's happening now, not much change. So how do you then ignore some aspect and claim that perhaps for it to be diplomatic, intellectually understood as a form of diplomacy, it must be this, straight-jacketed in the form of European understanding. And that's the problem. You take, for instance, the Athens, who attempted to reel the Melos to their side as against Sparta, which has given us the popular saying that says probably that it was the rise of Athens and the fear it instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. When the Fantis formed the Confederacy, why did they form the Confederacy? Why did they sign the bond of 1844? Because the rise of Asante was becoming highly problematic. The Asantes have succeeded in silencing the Dacians, has succeeded in silencing the Achim, has succeeded in silencing the Apemu, so they were just unstoppable. How do you deal with that? It made the alliance inevitable for them to form that alliance. So it was the rise of that the rise of Shaka Zulu's kingdom made the alliance between the Kweb, Metamba, the rest also inevitable. You have similar instances. So it's the more reason we are saying that then, if that is the case, you cannot tell me that the other side, whatever engagement that we're going on, if we find similar expressions even today, why do we ignore them? And so we are making a case that if indeed it is similar to what we are seeing, that the politics and everything is virtually the same, then those ones are equally important for us to refer to in our engagement with our students, in our engagement with other policymakers. So it's your comment even makes it more important that yes, it is important to raise these issues. Okay.
I guess just to respond very briefly, I realize we're running low on time here. Yeah, I agree. We in terms of challenging existing narratives, this has been really important for this kind of decolonizing work in fields of history and culture. The thing I've noticed, though, is that once we look at the kind of the liberation movements that were taking place from the 1930s, 40s, 50s into the era of decolonization, you tended to notice that these were very forward-looking movements. As I said, they were revolutionary movements. But it's after the decolonization that we get what a post-colonial sort of milieu there, which you tend to get a focus on memory and the grievances of the past. And so I think something has shifted there, and I think we're dealing with something quite different from the 1960s onwards. It's a different type of imagining protest. It's a different type of resistance than we had in the past. So I guess just looking at that, I find it quite interesting. And so that was the kind of distinction I'm trying to make between these two.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you both. Are there any more questions as we wrap up? Is there a final comment, thoughts, question for our two great presenters? Yes, there's a hand. Israel. Yes, go ahead.
Please go ahead and ask your question.
Is it La Ella Israel? Can you hear us? The mic is on mute. Is there...
No, it's unmuted.
Okay.
Hello, we can hear you now if you speak. Oh, it's a little bit quiet though.
I'm not hearing.
I can only hear very faintly, unfortunately.
Oh, the connection is not so good.
No, sorry, I don't think it is.
I think,
okay,
if
maybe they could
submit
a question. Type the question.
Yes, I think she's trying to. Israel is trying to ask when the next session will take place.
Ah.
Oh, okay.
Jenny, do you have a date? Or not yet?
No date yet, but we're hoping to maintain sort of regular meetings, ideally monthly. So we'll keep you updated about the next seminar. Okay, great. Since we don't have any more questions,
I will hand over the closing remark to the Dean, Professor Samuel Burt Bodhi Kusi. Could we unmute the mic for Professor Samuel?
Professor Samuel, you should be able to unmute yourself. Ah, no. Yeah, it's okay then.
Let's try. Let me try reaching him by phone. Okay, yes. I think he's here. Prof, are you there?
Can you unmute yourself? I saw it flash off and it's come back on again.
Hello?
I'm not sure if Professor Samuel's there.
Okay, he's trying to unmute. Prof is trying to unmute and speak, but also too, he mentioned the vice dean is here too in case he's unsuccessful.
Yeah. Hello, can you please hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hear you now.
Oh, yeah. My sincere apologies. Yeah. I don't know, for some reason I think it's been a bit difficult. Yes, so let me be brief. I know it's been a long day, but let me first of all thank all of you, especially the team that's worked on this series and for us to get the first of its kind happening. My sincere gratitude to all of you, and also especially to our Cardiff team, Professor Ambrina and the team, for this to happen. I am excited that we have been able to do this beyond the Department of Optometry. And I'm looking forward to many more exciting and many more events happening. Let me say that now we've spoke to our friends also in York University, and they are also happy and willing to come on board this seminar series that is going to happen. So going forward, I'm sure it will not just be UCC and Cardiff, but some of our friends from York who are also interested in this kind of events will also be coming on board. And we are grateful to all of you for making this happen. And I want to believe that we can move forward beyond the seminar series to go into other things, especially with the grant applications, with research, and of course with mobility as well. And of course, in this era, even making sure that we can put some of our activities online, COIL, to get some of our students, to get some of our faculty teaching in both universities or even a tripartite universities that we will be working with. So once again, let me thank all of you, especially the chair and all of you for the roles, the speakers for the roles that you have played. I hope that going forward, we'll be able to expand the participation through the various platforms that we have in our various universities to make this a big event. And eventually, I do hope that we will be able to organize a joint physical conference between the two universities and other sister universities that may come on board in the future. So once again, thank you very much. And I will now hand over to the chair for the day. Thank you. God bless you.
Sorry, I was on mute. I was basically thanking everyone for their contribution, the presenters, the introduction, and thanking Cardiff University and all the members at UCC, and also thanking the audience for coming out, thanking the audience for the question that they raised. And we'll try to have this event next month, hopefully next month, to continue the momentum of this event. So thank you all, and have a good evening or a good day wherever you are. Okay, I say bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.